Welcome. This is our I should say bi-monthly Insights on Aging program, which is brought to you by our Counseling Services Department at CJE Senior Life. And my name is Sharon Dornberg-Lee. I'm the Clinical Director of Community Services at CJE. And I wanted to just mention a couple things about counseling services at CJE. Our services are available via telehealth, or it can be done in one of our offices. Counseling can be provided in our Rogers Park and Deerfield offices. We provide individual, family, and group therapy, and we have a whole variety of support groups. And I wanted to just highlight a few of our programs. We have 2 new therapy groups that are short-term that are starting this spring, and we need a few more people before we can get those going. One is for family caregivers, especially people who are experiencing a lot of caregiver stress or other concerns regarding their caregiving role. It's an 8-week group, so it's a short-term commitment. And the second group is for people who are experiencing chronic pain. That's also an 8-session group, and that's to learn some skills to manage chronic pain, some coping strategies, and both groups just to get support from others who are in similar situations. They're both led by our LCSW therapists. We also have Pearls counseling that we want to mention. In addition to traditional counseling, we offer Pearls, which is a one-on-one counseling relationship. It's an evidence-based model of treating depression in just 6 to 8 sessions. And so it's a more structured problem-solving approach toward feeling better if you've been feeling depressed, or if somebody you know or care about has been feeling depressed. Please help us to spread the word about those 2 groups and Pearls. And for all of these programs and all of our other services at CJE, you can call 773-508-1000, and they'll be happy to give you more information and connect you to these services. I also have my honor today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Beth Fishman. Beth is the Addiction Services Manager at our sister agency, JCFS Chicago, and she's worked with individuals and families who are impacted by a wide range of substance use disorders and other addictive behaviors for over 30 years. And in her role at JCFS, she trains Jewish communal professionals about addiction, and she teaches treatment professionals about the cultural and spiritual needs of Jews who are in recovery. She supports clients and their loved ones before, during, and after treatment. She runs groups to support addiction and recovery, and she assists Jewish communities around the country in developing programs to address addiction. Beth is a licensed clinical psychologist in Illinois and in New Mexico, interestingly. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Beth. Good morning, and thank you for being with us for our program today.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm thrilled to be here. And although I was going to say thrilled to see you all, I can't see you, but I know that you're there, and I'm very happy to have your participation. So I'm going to start to share my screen. So we are talking today about a very important, but also very difficult, challenging topic about when a family faces addiction. But what exactly will we be talking about? We're going to start with looking at addiction itself so that we're all on the same page about what addiction actually is. And then we'll ask, like, what is the family disease of addiction? Why is addiction even called a family disease? What happens in the family program, as it's known? And maybe most importantly of all, what can we all do to help? And lastly, we will answer the question, and I think I'm going to give this one away in advance, is there even reason for hope? And the answer there absolutely is yes. So we'll start again with addiction. I want to say very quickly that Language in this field is very important and it's changing all the time. So the word addiction isn't even used anymore professionally. Last maybe 4 or 5 years now, we call addiction substance use disorders. Or you may see the letters SUD, which stands for substance use disorder. So you may see those acronyms or those words, that name here in this presentation a time or two. But in general, we'll still use the word addiction because that's what we generally use, even though it's not official anymore. We're going to begin by hearing from a couple of women and a couple of kids about their experience.
I knew that my addiction was a problem when I was choosing drugs over my child and when I couldn't take care of my little girl without being high.
Mommy said Daddy had to go away because he didn't stop me doing drugs. Mommy used to do a lot of fun stuff, but we don't really do any fun stuff anymore. Mommy rather stay home and drink, but she doesn't like to play with me and Sarah while she's drinking.
And my husband and I did a lot of meth together. We have 2 small children. I have a 7-year-old little boy and a 5-year-old little girl. I was physically there, but I was never there for them emotionally. And in the end of my addiction, I was not involved in their life.
Addiction took my daddy away and made us so we can't be a family anymore. Mommy and me with Daddy would get better.
I have a little girl that is 3. She's almost 4. Her name is Reese. I definitely put drugs in front of her. She lived in a household that was full of just constant chaos and drug use. Our drug use would cause, our fights to get violent. Reese witnessed one of those fights. She was asking her dad why he was hurting her mommy. And she was just begging him to stop.
I wish Mommy didn't drink. And I miss the way it used to be. Sarah and I wanted Mommy back.
And one day my son said, I don't have a mommy or a daddy. And it was then that I realized I had to do something different.
Yeah, so like I said, tough stuff, important topic, but just really difficult. And there are a lot of themes that we heard from those women and those kids that we're going to hear again and again, because families that are struggling with addiction have a lot of very similar characteristics like chaos and violence and neglect. So we'll hear more about that. Unfortunately, we'll hear more about that. So the women in that video, let me see if I can get my pointer working here. No, I guess not. Oop, sorry, I want to go back. All right, so the women in the video were talking about methamphetamine. One of the women said she and her husband used to do a lot of meth together. So obviously we can be addicted to drugs and to alcohol. One of the girls mentioned how her mama liked to drink and wasn't playing with her anymore. But there are all kinds of other things that we can be addicted to, right? For example, gambling. Gambling so much so that there's now a new diagnosis of gambling disorder. And one can be diagnosed with gambling disorder, and it's under the umbrella of other addiction disorders. In fact, it's the very first diagnosis of an addiction that is not a drug or alcohol. So it's kind of important, actually, that people can be diagnosed with a gambling addiction now officially. But gaming is another issue, that another behavior or activity that people can be addicted to. Shopping is a big problem for a lot of folks, online shopping or in person. There it is. I'm sorry, I just saw my pointer and I wanted the pointer. There we go. And also, wouldn't you know, but it seems like just about everything about our devices is addictive. What can't we be addicted to online anymore? Social media like Facebook, Instagram, shopping and gambling and gaming and online pornography. And we can order our drugs online now and have them delivered right to our door. So there are all kinds of things and all kinds of ways that people are addicted these days. And it's so challenging, truly, because the method or the means for our addiction is right in the palm of our hand, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through our devices. It's never been like that in all of human history. We're living in a particularly challenging time right now for addiction. So let's learn a little bit more, though, about what addiction actually is.
It's important to understand that everyone in the world has addictions, or rather natural addictions, to things that are good, like food, water, and sleep. These natural addictions are important for our health and survival, and without them, we would not hunger or crave the things we need to survive. Now, we aren't exactly born with these natural addictions. Our body creates them. Let's look at an example. When you bite into an apple, your brain says, yum. Your brain recognizes that this apple is good for you. It has nutrition, vitamins, and gives your body the energy it needs to survive. Whenever the brain recognizes something that's good, it releases a
Oops. Sorry.
chemical called dopamine. Dopamine causes you to experience pleasure. It's what makes you feel good, like when biting into an apple. The brain releases this dopamine in order to teach the body that this is healthy and good for your survival, and that it should remember to do it again. Now, there are other things we do that can release the pleasurable dopamine, like playing video games, exercising, or reading a good book. However, the amount of dopamine released during these activities is less than what's released when we eat food. The brain does this so it can recognize which is more important. So if you go 2 days without reading a book, or 2 days without eating food, your body is going to crave the food over the book. As such, your brain creates what's called a hierarchy of survival, which ranks how important each of these things is to your survival. Now, there are some things that will not cause the release of dopamine, like soap or punching yourself in the face. The brain knows that these things are not good, and therefore does not release the pleasurable dopamine because your brain does not want you to do it again. Now, let's look at alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, and other drugs. These are all classified carcinogens, proven to cause cancer and other fatal diseases. Now, your brain should recognize that these things are harmful to your body. However, these substances have special chemical characteristics that fool the brain into releasing dopamine, oftentimes in much greater amounts than the body has ever experienced before. Because of this, the body is fooled into thinking that these things are good and important, sometimes even more important than food, water, or sleep, and consequently hijacks the #1 spot in your survival hierarchy. So now, if you go 2 days without eating or 2 days without drinking alcohol, your body will actually crave the alcohol over the food. This is an extreme case of addiction, where the person addicted believes that they will die if they don't get it.
Okay, so the part about all of that that I want to emphasize is that when we drink alcohol at a certain level or take certain drugs in a certain way or get involved with certain activities that can be addictive, those chemicals or those activities dump a whole bunch of dopamine into the brain, an unnaturally large amount of dopamine over and over and over again. And it's that abnormally, unnaturally large amount of dopamine being poured into the brain repeatedly over time that is the root cause of addiction. If I had $1 for every time I've heard a question like this, and I don't mean to demean the question at all, because actually it's a really good question. It's an important question, which is why I want to address it here, but truly it's very, very common. If I had $1 for every time I've heard it, I wouldn't be in rainy Chicago right now. I'd be on the beach in the French Riviera. So let's look at this question. It's, in this case, a statement. Somebody will come to me, usually the loved one of someone with addiction, and this person will say to me, I'm being told that addiction is a disease, but it doesn't seem like a disease. It doesn't seem like an illness. What I see with my loved one is she's making bad decisions. She's engaging in bad behavior. She's making bad choices. She's just behaving badly. And I know plenty of people who are sick, have really serious illnesses. People are really seriously sick. And they act sick, but they're not making bad decisions. They're not making bad choices. They're not hanging out with bad people. They're not doing any of that stuff. So how is addiction the same as these other diseases? It doesn't make sense. And you know what? On the surface, this person is right. On the surface, it doesn't make sense. So let's look a little bit under the surface. Really quickly, I think, because these pictures may be enough. So here on the left, this is a healthy, normal brain. We're looking from the top down, and the brain is very smooth, right? Sort of plump looking. It almost looks like a bowl of big fat noodles. Now, there are, of course, wrinkles here. Those are supposed to be there because that increases the surface of the brain. So there's more surface tissue, and that's a good thing. But if we look here on the right, this is the brain where there had been addiction. And look at all of these like potholes. It looks like somebody went at this brain with like a melon baller, these big sunken areas, all of this brain tissue missing or sunken in. This is a very diseased brain, truly. This brain is sick. Let's look at another one. These are functional MRI pictures. Functional MRI is when they take an MRI of the brain when the person is busy doing something. They're thinking about something, they're trying to figure out a puzzle, or they're reading. So the brain is very busy, it's very engaged. On the left, again, we have a nice, healthy brain. And all of this bright yellow and the light yellow down here and the light blue is all of this really good, active brain tissue. And on the right, this is the brain of someone with a cocaine addiction. And look at there, I mean, there is some yellow activity, that's good. But look at these big, big areas of dark tissue where there's barely anything happening. This also is a very, very diseased brain. So if we go back to this question, it doesn't seem like a disease because the person is behaving badly. So let's take a parallel example. If we think about somebody with a different kind of disease, like asthma, for example. So asthma is a lung disease, and the lungs have to do with breathing and with oxygen. So if the lungs are diseased, as during an asthma attack, in asthma, the person will have trouble breathing. They'll have trouble bringing oxygen into their body. Their lungs feel tight, they're wheezing or coughing, and the amount of oxygen in their blood goes way down because the lungs have to do with breathing and oxygen. So what's the parallel with the brain? What does the brain have to do with, so to speak? Well, the brain has to do with about 1 million things, but the parts of the brain that get impacted by addiction are the parts of the brain that have to do with making decisions, choosing our behavior, choosing all kinds of things, the ways we feel and the things that we do. So in fact, when we see somebody who is active in their addiction and they're making bad decisions and making bad choices and acting in ways that we say are bad, what they actually are doing is showing us the symptoms of their diseased brain. These bad decisions, bad behavior, bad choices are symptoms of the disease. So I hope that in the future, if we know people or see people who are active in their addiction and they're doing these things, we'll not have stigma around that. We won't shame them, but we will understand that their actual literal behavior is the symptom of addiction. I hope that makes sense. That's such an important idea. So addiction is also called a family disease. So what does that mean? We are going to hear from Jim Savage. He's an addiction professional. He's worked in the field many, many years, and he works especially with loved ones, family members of somebody who is in treatment. Let's hear what he has to say about addiction as a family disease.
One of the first things I like to do when I start working with new parents is to help them get clear about how addictive behavior affects the entire family system. I have this presentation I call the 8-second lecture on chemical dependency. It goes something like this. Here's the addict. Here's the addict's chemical. Addiction is this person's life begins to revolve around the use of the chemical. It's that simple. My experience is that usually by the time I'm done drawing this circle, family members are starting to nod and they say, yep, that's it. And then I'll say, since we saved so much time on that, we can move ahead to the 8-second lecture on codependency, which goes something like this. And unfortunately, this person has other people in his life. And the 8-second lecture on codependency is these people's lives begin to revolve around this person's life, which is revolving around the use of the chemical. What kind of day these people have depends on what kind of day this guy has, which depends on his relationship with the mood-altering substance at the time. They are, in a sense, codependent. And that's codependency at its most base definition. You can't argue with that. And again, it's my experience that when I draw that second circle, family members start really nodding. They really get that one. You may be having that experience right now as you're seeing this for the first time. But we also need to go a little further and take a look at what's going on emotionally here. Anytime there's an addiction in a family system, there are going to be a lot of unresolved feelings that can easily end up getting displaced. The people around the substance user are going to be angry, they're hurt, they're scared. Some of them might be feeling guilty or ashamed. And again, those are just the feelings that are directly related to the substance user. But then there's also going to be a lot of stuff going on between the individual family members. The diagram here shows a real common dynamic we see when the client's a teen or a young adult. And that's the parents who aren't on the same page as far as how they're dealing with the issue. You know, one's usually the tough guy and one's usually the enabler. And that can end up causing some pretty significant problems in their relationship. Or on the other hand, if the substance user is an adult in the family, there's a ton of different ways that relationships are damaged. Kids might be mad at the other parent for allowing the problem to continue. Or the kids could be mad thinking that the other parent's being too mean by making mom or dad go to treatment, and they end up choosing sides. And then it's not uncommon to see that kind of alignment or triangulation go on throughout the family. Adult siblings stop talking to each other. In-laws might chime in with their opinion about what's going on. So you see what this can end up looking like. Then we can't leave out the person who's actually at the center of all this. Even though they're identified as one who's causing all the problems, they've got feelings too. They're probably angry, mostly because of how the people around them are responding to their behavior. But underneath that, there's a good chance they're scared. Because on some level, they probably realize that they keep messing up and they're not able to stop. And they're not sure that they're ever going to be able to change. Add to that, then they probably got some guilt and shame about their behavior, but they're sure not going to let on to that. Then there's the underlying issues that might be the whole reason that they're using in the first place. And the bottom line is this whole family system becomes just a mess of unresolved feelings. And that's what we've got when a family enters into treatment. And so
A mess of unresolved feelings. 100%. That is a family with active addiction. And it's very likely, not 100%, nothing is 100%, but it's very likely that this family had a mess of unresolved feelings long before the addiction ever started. And that all of that mess of unresolved feelings, in other words, a family that doesn't really know how to function well, is in part the cause of the addiction. Now, I want to say just very quickly a couple of things. Jim Savage, awesome guy, uses a couple of words in here that I don't love. This video is a few years old, and he's probably not using those words anymore either. Remember, I said at the beginning, a lot about language and addiction is changing very quickly. So we don't usually use the word enabler anymore. Used to be classically the woman of a man who is an alcoholic. Now we understand that the wives, or either spouse, but traditionally the wife, is traumatized and trying to hold her family together, not enabling the addiction. He also refers to the young person who is the client as the addict, and we don't use that kind of language anymore either. We refer to people first. So we would say a young person with a cannabis use disorder, in this case, because it looks like that's cannabis in that bong there, or a person with a substance use disorder, or hopefully a person in recovery. That's the kind of new language that we're using. So it's helpful, I think, to see in a sort of cartoon animation like this, the fundamental issues that happen in a family with addiction. But it's very different to hear from the people who have lived it. So let's do that now. Let's hear from Tori.
Tori Brinkman has always been a survivor, born 15 weeks early, a tiny pound and a half, and that was just the beginning of her struggle. For the first 10 years of her life, she lived with a mother addicted to heroin. Their history together shows how savage the grip of addiction can be. Today, Tori is a remarkably composed 14-year-old telling her story, her way. What do you remember about those early years and your mom?
She never ate. She'd have maybe a Coke a day, no water, and then go right back to bed. And she'd never take care of me, never feed me. I had to feed myself. I consider myself as the parent and my mom the kid.
Do you think your mom sold drugs?
Yeah, I know she did.
She got in trouble for that?
Yeah. One time, I think I was around 7 or 8, she actually made me do a drug deal for her.
A drug deal? Like, what did she ask you to do?
She puts either heroin or cocaine in a napkin or something, and she said, run up to that house, go get the money, and give this to them.
Tori says she never got any health care growing up.
None until I was 10. Never went to the dentist. I had never been to the dentist before.
What about pediatrician,
Nope.
doctor? No?
Nothing.
Her mom told Tori not to tell anyone about the things she saw in their home, but Tori would call her grandparents when they ran out of food. 3 years ago, Lillian and Richard were awarded legal custody.
When she first came to live with us permanently, she was blaming herself. Maybe if I was better, Mom wouldn't have done the drugs.
And it wasn't just Tori's mom abusing heroin in their home. It was also her uncle, the closest person Tori had to a father figure.
What happened to your uncle?
He passed away November 20th, 2015 from a drug overdose.
Heroin?
Mm-hmm.
That must have been super hard for you.
Yeah, because, I mean, he basically took care of me instead of my mom. Like, if my mom was asleep, he'd take care of me. And so it was just, it was sad.
Hang on. You want Kleenex? I have one.
I got one over here.
Come here.
It's really hard stuff to talk about.
At 14 years old, Tori has seen enough pain for a lifetime, making her spirit and attitude today all the more impressive.
Here's a big question.
Okay.
Why are you talking to us?
Because I want to spread awareness of how drugs have not only affected my life, but have probably affected a lot of other kids' lives. And I want to just like help people.
Tori's mother knows that she's sharing this story. She's been sober now for 3 years. She's working 2 jobs. Tori tells us that she's proud of her mother, and the two of them see each other every week. And Lester, with nearly 1 million people in the US saying that they admit to using heroin, that means there are hundreds of thousands of stories like Tori's.
I'm just blown away. She's 14,
Yeah.
wise beyond her years, but then
Absolutely.
think of what she's seen.
She's grown up too quickly, her grandmother says.
Oh, so Tori's story, her life, has so many of the classic characteristics of an addicted family. The secrecy, when her mom said, don't tell, mom didn't want her to tell anybody what was going on in the house. Very common. Tori's grandmother said, when Tori first came to live with us, she blamed herself. So that also very, very common for the children in a family to blame themselves in some way for their parents' addiction. Tori herself mentioned, I thought of myself as the parent and my mother as the kid. So that role reversal is also very common because the parents are not being parents, not taking care of their kids. So the kids are taking care of themselves and oftentimes siblings and even their parents. So a lot of role reversal, as Tori described, and clearly neglect is part of that. I mean, her neglect was pretty extreme. No food, no medical care, no dental care. It's hard to hear. Tori also has she's experienced all of the loss and the separation and the grief that is very common in families with addiction. So she lost her uncle to overdose, who was clearly the only parent type person she had in her life, and obviously still pretty torn up about that. But that's the more, I guess, obvious loss that she's had, because she also, in a way, very important way, lost her mother. Even though her mother, thank goodness, is still living, but Tori is not living with her mother. She was separated from her mother for her own good, thank goodness. But, kids want to be with their moms and their dads, even when their parents are not very good for them. It's just a natural thing. So she, no doubt, at some level, is grieving the loss of the only home she knew, and that type of relationship, daily relationship with her mother. What we didn't hear about with Tori, so we don't know if in fact there was more abuse or if they just didn't go there in this interview, but it is very typical for there to be physical abuse of children, sexual abuse of children. I certainly would say that having a 7 or 8-year-old doing a drug deal is a form of abuse. So a lot of very difficult and classic symptoms of family addiction in Tori's story. But I tell you what, thank goodness for those grandparents. Thank goodness for those grandparents. I wonder how long they fought in the courts in order to get permanent custody of Tori. There are so many grandparents taking care of their grandchildren because of addiction that there's now a word for it, grandfamilies. There's an organization, national organization called grandfamilies.org. A bunch of years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago or more, I did a training at JCFS for foster parents. At that time, JCFS had a contract with DCFS to provide foster care. So there were JCFS foster families. So being the addiction specialist at JCFS, I went to do a training for the foster parents because so many of the kids were coming into foster care because their parents couldn't take care of them because of addiction. So I went to do a training on addiction for the foster parents, and it became clear very quickly that easily 75%, maybe more, of the folks there weren't just the foster parents, they were the grandparents. They were taking care of their grandkids because their own kids weren't able to do that because of addiction. And so those grandparents were stepping up to take care of their grandkids, and they had a lot of shame and grief and anger at their own kids and at themselves, because somehow they wondered if they had messed up as parents to have raised children that became addicted. It's very tough stuff. In 2019, when the US Census was done, over 70,000 grandparents were found to have responsibility for their grandchildren just in Illinois alone. So that being about 5 years ago now, I have no doubt that there's more than 71,000, 72,000, no doubt. What if it's on the opposite side, though, and it's the grandparents who have the addiction? What happens then for a family? Well, first I'll say that there is much less understanding about addiction in older adults than there is for teen addiction or addiction in younger adults. There's less research, there's less training and education, so doctors and mental health professionals have less understanding of it, less experience with older adults and addiction. So older adults are assessed for addiction less often. There are many fewer treatment programs, if that's even a way to say it. There are fewer treatment programs for older adults than there are for teens or for middle-aged adults, and also a lot less family support. And none of that is good. But thankfully, all of that is changing, and it's changing pretty rapidly right now for the first time. Really, really grateful that that's the case. So adult children and grandchildren may do one of two things. Families tend to kind of fall into one of two camps. And of course, it's not quite this black and white, but just for the sake of argument, what we do see is that some families, when their grandparents or older adult parents are struggling with addiction, they may ignore it, or they'll accept it, or they make excuses for it. They'll say things like, my dad worked so hard his whole life, why shouldn't he enjoy his retirement now? Or, my mom's not hurting anybody. You know, she lives alone. This is how she enjoys her time. It gives her comfort. Why should we bother her? Then there are families I first want to say actually, that the families that ignore and accept and excuse, they tend to do those things across the board when difficulties come into their lives. So it isn't just about this set of grandparents or just about addiction. These are the families that don't have the coping skills to know how to deal with hard things when hard things come along. So if they don't know how to deal with them, they ignore them, or they accept them, or they excuse them away. It's not a functional way to live, but it is just the truth for some families. And on the other side, we have families that are willing and able to engage with this process of addiction and treatment and recovery for their older adult parents or grandparents. And they tend to present as being two things. One is fearful, because the definition of addiction can be that it is a chronic, relapsing, potentially fatal illness, brain-based disease. Potentially fatal. That's scary. Every family with addiction is fearful, because everybody knows that addiction can be fatal, that overdose happens. So families are fearful and they're also frustrated. They're frustrated maybe in part because of their older adult grandparents' behavior. They wish, that they'd get into treatment sooner. They were ready for treatment sooner. They wish the addiction never happened. So there's frustration. And there's also frustration at the lack of good systems, like not enough treatment programs, like I just said, not enough support for the family, that the doctors don't understand. All of that is very frustrating. So these are understandable reactions. But when there is treatment for older adults can be unbelievably effective. In fact, older adults do better in addiction treatment than any other age population in the country. And I think that makes sense because, as we age, as we enter into older adulthood, we have lived through a lot. There's no way we haven't lived through hard things. That's just life. Life happens. And we have to learn, we hopefully have learned, good coping strategies, ways to overcome and deal with hard times. And so we can bring all of that experience and all of that maturity into our addiction treatment. And we do very well at getting into recovery and staying in recovery. So I think that's very hopeful. Good treatment for older adults, the best kind of treatment, will be with same age peers. So it'll be an older adult program, just like teens have teen programs for addiction recovery. And younger adults or middle-aged adults are in treatment with their same age peers too. So this is what's been lacking and is now happening. Older adult treatment is now becoming more available in more places. Best treatment is non-confrontational, and that's true across the board. Used to be that, kind of shockingly, treatment for addiction was very confrontational. And there are even whole TV programs about it. There's one called Intervention. I hope it's still not a program, but you could probably find old episodes on YouTube. And there's all this yelling and screaming and shaming and blaming, and that's in treatment. It's awful. And now, of course, we know that the majority of people with addiction have a trauma history that in part led to their addiction. And then they go into treatment and they're being re-traumatized by being yelled at and shamed. How is that helpful? It's not. So non-confrontational treatment approaches are best, and certainly for older adults who respond best to warm, sympathetic, nurturing approaches at hard times. It's very important in treatment for older adults to focus on building social networks because many people come into older adult addiction treatment having lost important relationships. It could be because of the addiction itself. Some of those symptomatic behaviors in addiction drives people away. But it could be the opposite, where folks have moved away, loved ones may have died, folks may have gone into care, and social networks have therefore naturally diminished and shrunk. And that may lead somebody to begin to drink more, spend more time online in ways that are not healthy, etc. So rebuilding or building good, solid social relationships and networks is very important. And of course, medical care, because we all need good medical care as we age. And if we're needing detox, you need to have good doctors who can manage the medications that we're going to stay on and safely remove the medications that we need not to be on anymore if that's part of the addiction. So good medical care. A few words about treatment in general. There are 4 levels of treatment. Residential being the kind where you go and you live in the treatment facility for a while, either because you need to be monitored through a detox or because the person is not actually safe to be just living at home or out in the community because their risk of overdose is too high. The next level down, PHP, is called Partial Hospitalization Program. Terrible name because it has nothing to do with hospitalization. Don't know how that got started. What it basically is you go to treatment all day long and then you go home at night. You're safe to be home, but you need enough support and intervention and counseling and education and care that you need to be at treatment 8 hours a day. The next level down from there, IOP, is intensive outpatient program. And that's basically half of a PHP. So you're there half the day, and then you go do what you do for the other half of the day, and then you go home at night. And then lastly is your regular outpatient, which is just maybe 1 hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week. The length for any of these levels of care can vary, and unfortunately is way too often determined by insurance, which says 28 days sounds good, but we know from research that actually that's not enough. That 3 months or 6 months or a year is really much, much better. But very few people receive that much treatment or any treatment at all. It's estimated maybe 10% of folks who need treatment get it because there simply isn't enough treatment around and there's not enough money to pay for it. And then lastly, treatment should address the substance use itself, obviously, the addiction, but also the mental health pieces, because most people who have an addiction also have depression or anxiety or attention deficit disorder or bipolar disease, any number of mental health concerns. So both need to be involved. And of course, treatment should involve the family. So the family program, what is that? Every good treatment program will involve the family either for an afternoon or a weekend or a week. And the idea is to take that family that we saw in Jim Savage's video with the circles and all those angry red lightning bolts of emotion between, to heal up that family, to create a positive recovery environment so that when the person is discharged from treatment, they're not going back into that family, because the odds of staying well in that family are about 0. So the family gets good education about addiction, and then all these things they learn through counseling, how to function better, how to be a healthy, functioning family at last, so that treatment works. I don't know if you can see that with the toolbar, but we're talking now about how we can support an older adult in recovery. First of all, go to the family program, super important. Number 2, help with the community linkages that the social worker in the treatment program will help to provide. So when someone's discharged, an older adult may be discharged needing new medical care, or an additional psychiatrist, or new housing, or new physical therapy, or new support groups, all kinds of things. So families can help with those linkages. Families can also attend support group meetings for themselves, like Families Anonymous, Al-Anon, Smart Recovery Friends and Family. These are all free. They're support groups that are in the community. There's lots of them here and everywhere. They're national, international, in fact. And they help the families of loved ones with addiction. Okay, we're coming to the end now. How can we help a family if we're not actually part of that family? If we're a friend, a loved one on the outside, how do we help? So think about who in that family you know best, who's your friend. Sit down with that person and say, I really care about you. You're important to me. We've been friends for 15 years, and you know what? I'm worried. And then you tell them what you've seen. I've seen you do this, or I've seen your husband do that. I'm worried about you. Is there anything you want to talk about? Is something going on? And there's usually one of 3 reactions. One is, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine. And we say, okay, I'm so glad to hear that. I'm always here for you. Because, you've opened the door then, and that's enough. The second reaction can be, what do you mean? How dare you? Okay, we don't fight back. We say, I'm so glad to hear that. That's such a relief. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to offend. It's only, coming from love. And let it go. Because again, you've opened the door. And then lastly, the third reaction that we hope to get is, I'm so glad you asked, because yes, we have a big problem in the family and I don't know what to do. So you listen, and then you have your resources. You've brought resources, phone numbers, and you say to your friend, I hear you, and it sounds like you don't know who to call, but you know what? I think I might. And I have this phone number for CJE or JCFS or some other place. How about if I sit with you while you make this call, and we'll see if we can start getting you the help you need. And then also offer that concrete help, because when we have folks in our lives who are sick with other traditional diseases, what do? We make food for this family, right? We offer to drive them to doctor's appointments. We walk their dog. We help take care of their kids. All the things that we do. You know how often that happens with families with addiction? Never. 2% of the time. So let's change that. Let's be that concrete help. And let's stick by our friend and their family consistently. So we've come to the end, and is there reason for hope? So addiction, yes, it is agonizing. And yes, it is hard to treat. No question. But in 2020, the CDC and NIDA, the National Institutes for Drug Abuse, found that 75% of people who experience addiction end up in recovery, ultimately. 75%. It's huge. Wonderful. And then I love this quote, and here's where we'll end. We are literally surrounded by people who are in recovery from substance use disorder, addiction, but we don't know it. Isn't that amazing? Because the symptomatic behaviors of addiction are very obvious. The arrests, the bad behavior that we talked about earlier. But somebody who's in addiction recovery, what is there to see? Nothing. They're just going about their lives. And the things that they're doing to support their recovery, like going to meetings, talking to their sponsor, exercising, we either don't see those things or we wouldn't associate them with recovery necessarily. They're just at the gym like everybody else. Very, very hopeful. And I love the fact that I can end on a hopeful note. So this is one of those resources, the clinical intake team at CJE Senior Life, but we will be giving you a whole bunch of other resources, including this one, later. And on behalf of JCFS Chicago and the Addiction Services Program, I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn things back over to Sharon. Should I stop sharing the screen, Sharon? Would that be best? All righty.
I have a technical problem. I'm so sorry. I can't unmute.
We can hear you, Sharon.
Oh, you can hear me? Okay.
Yep.
On my computer, it says it's muted and won't unmute. I'm having some technical issues this morning. I'm delighted you can hear me.
Oh, you just cut out.
What about now?
Oh, now you're good. Here you
Okay, my computer is not cooperating this morning. So I am so happy you're here with us. Dr. Fishman, what, as you said, sometimes difficult to hear information, but what valuable information you shared with us this morning. It was really an education, I think, for all of us to learn more about addiction and how it impacts the family, and also very importantly, ways that we can help. So please do know that CJE, JCFS are here to support you, your friends and family, your loved ones, if you have questions for us or if we can help in any way. CJE's number again is 773-508-1000.